Gary LaFontaine's Twist Nymph comes in several variations. In this particular one, we'll be tying the bead head, Peacock Herl, Twist Nymph. And what you'll need by way of materials is Marabou, in this particular case a burnt orange, small ultra wire, a dubbing wax of some form, olive dubbing, and Antron dubbing. But the thing about the Antron dubbing, this happens to be a ginger variant, is that you'll need to cut it up into short, very short pieces. You can use the yarn or the dubbing, but it has to be short pieces. We'll talk about that more in a minute. It's said that the Twist Nymph was one of Gary LaFontaine's favorite still watering patterns. It can actually be used in both still and running water. However, when I use it in still water, I tend to rely on just the bead for the weight. When I use it in running water, I will tend to put lead or a no lead wire underbody underneath just to help it get down, get under the surface. Gives me a little, I feel it gives me a little better control in the running water. Thread color is said in some of the references that you should match the thread color to the highlight color. In this particular case, it would be the ginger variant. I tend to go a little different, where I'll use black for the unweighted or the versions without the lead, non-lead underbody for still water, and then I'll tend to match the highlight color, some form of orange, for the weighted underbody for the running water variants. Just makes it easy for me to tell in the box at a glance, well, sort of at a glance, which one's weighted, which one's not. For me, the toughest part was figuring out how long the tail should be, the Marabou tail. In one of the references I have, it shows a body length at least equal to the 2x long hook, in this case a Tiemco 5262, 2x long hook body. I tend to see it more appropriate as the length of the hook shank behind the bead. In a sense, it's a little like creating a woolly worm. Where the tail length is less than the length of the body. A lot of that will be up to your sense of aesthetic and the effect that you're after. That just happens to be my preference. I think the ones that come commercially tend to have the shorter tails. Now what we're going to do is basically what we did when we used a dubbing loop to reinforce the Peacock Herl, except that this will be just a little bit different. It's a technique that LaFontaine came up with. It's a technique that some argue can be easily replicated now with orange dyed Peacock Herl. I think to a degree they're probably right, but they're also wrong in that one of the aspects of this fly and the technique we're about to use is what Gary LaFontaine called double magic. He maintained that Antron and Peacock Herl had almost magical properties when it came to catching fish. So by combining the Antron and the Peacock Herl, he declared that this was his double magic technique. In other words, you're using two magical properties, hoping to create a trigger effect for the fish to take. So what you do is you create a loop with your wire. You create a loop with your wire, then you add dubbing wax down the one side. And this is where chopping up the Antron yarn or dubbing becomes important, because it's what LaFontaine referred to as touch dubbing. You take this and you just touch it to the wax. You don't wind it on there. You don't create a loop with it per se. You just touch it. And as you can see, it creates a fairly, all along that wax portion, it creates a fairly thin dubbing. And he would say that there's no other way to create that effect, no other dubbing technique that will create that effect. And I think he's probably right, was probably right. Now what you do is you just create your dubbing loop like we did for the fullback. And what you'll have is a variegation in the coloring. You'll have the Peacock Herl with the ginger variant highlights. There's virtually no insect in nature that has a single color body. There's always some variation to the color. Now he would use, at least from what I understand, he would use his touch dubbing technique again for the collar. I tend to go a little different direction. I tend to create a dubbing loop. This is my own personal blend of olive, several different types of olive, Antron, hare's ear, etc. I had to guess, his rationale would be that it creates a contrast but what I like to do is once I've whip finished and clipped off my thread, I like to get in there and rough up the head of the collar a little bit. Help cover up not only the whip finish, but add just that little bit more movement to the materials. And notice the variegation in the color in the body, the orange or ginger variant highlights. It's a relatively easy pattern to tie. Give it a try. See what you think.